何してんの？
何ってもちろん収穫だけど
なんだそら。
収穫ってもちろん優勝の収穫ですよ。
ああ、そうですか。
Welcome to my OP08.5 and OP09 Doflamingo guide. In this video, we're going to be covering what kind of deck Doflamingo is and how he wants to play generally, the types of Doflamingo lists that you can run based on your local meta or your personal playstyle, a few gameplay tips, and a few matchup tips. Now, there's a much more in-depth guide that is currently on me and CrossAI's Patreon that you can check out if you are interested in the full version of this guide. However, this is going to be treated as an introduction, and even for those who don't really feel like paying for it, this should be a reasonable starting point for people who want to get into Doflamingo. Hey guys, it is now midnight of the 21st, which means it's time to pick a winner for the giveaway. So in the time frame of the giveaway, I had 3 videos, and I'll just be running a random number generator to choose which video to choose a random comment from. I'll be doing this in the order of 1 meaning the oldest, and then 3 meaning the newest. So let's see what we get. Random number generator from 1 to 3. Okay, 1. Okay, so we have all of the comments loaded in, and let's just pick a winner, I guess. Congratulations to TheBellTolls. The comment reads, "Thank you for being such a RP Luffy supporter. I need that confidence." Thank you for supporting RP Luffy as well. It's honestly such a fun deck, and even if it's not the top of the meta, I think that it really is solid. So I think if you enjoy RP Luffy, then just keep believing. Nonetheless, you won the giveaway, so please contact me somehow, either on Discord or Twitter. There will of course be a verification process, and then I'll get the sleeves to you. First, let's talk about Doflamingo's leader ability. Now, Doflamingo is an interesting leader because he's been in the game since OP01. He has the ability for 2 dong on his leader and 1 dong rested on attack, play the 4 cost or less warlord from the top of his deck rested. There are 2 main points that you can take away from this leader effect that'll help you decide what to do in-game as Doflamingo. The first and most important thing that people will notice is that for technically 3 dong, because it's 2 dong on your leader and then 1 dong on your dong area, you're playing a 4 cost. The one caveat, of course, is that this is played off of the top of your deck and not out of your hand, so you might not always have control over what you end up playing. If you can play higher value cards for less dong, then you are getting more value inherently. This is why leaders like Red Green Law used to be so strong, because if the condition was met, then he could play any 5 cost in his hand for only 2 dong. Doflamingo in this way is very similar, because for 1 dong rested and a 7,000 attack, he can play any 4 cost, assuming that it's on the top of his deck. Now, to support this caveat, there are many cards such as Perona, or in the new start deck, Buggy, that can help you reorder your deck to make sure that you don't actually miss your leader effect, and also make sure that you play something strong. As such, one of the first things that we can notice for Doflamingo's leader is that he's a very efficient leader. He can attack very hard while playing his board, being able to do 2 things at once that most leaders can't do. With the new Doflamingo buffs in ST17, we have many new cards to be able to work with. Before, Doflamingo would play a very templated set of moves. He would play on 1 dong, Perona. He would play on 3 dong, his leader effect. On 5 dong, 6,000 with his leader, and then play Jinbe and presumably, hopefully, Weevil. And then on 7 dong, you'd play another 4 cost and leader effect. This was the powerful move that Doflamingo has, and this is very strong on paper. The issue, however, with this deck was that if you were second, you were just doing the exact same moves as if you were going first, just 1 turn later. As such, it was an extremely first-reliant deck with very templated moves, meaning that if you didn't get this perfect template of moves, you're losing a lot of power as a deck. ST17 effectively solves all of these problems, which is why, in Japan currently, at least in OP09, it is by far the best deck in the format, and presumably in OP08.5 it should be pretty top tier as well. The other note to mention in regards to Doflamingo's leader ability is that the character comes out rested. In the One Piece card game, it's important to understand that there's a dialogue between every action. When you attack the opponent, you're asking the opponent how are they going to respond to that. When the opponent attacks back into you, they're asking you how you're going to respond into that. However, as Doflamingo's characters played off of his leader ability are played rested, the opponent is allowed to ask the question first. This means that if you're in a situation where you feel like you need to defend, then you're cutting an extra card from your hand to be able to start hitting. What this can result in is if you counter too hard, that you're going to have no cards in your hand to be able to play your late game. As such, rather than thinking of Doflamingo as an aggro deck, I recommend that you think of Doflamingo as a mid-range deck. Now, in this video version, I won't be going over every single card and how to use them optimally in the start deck or the decks, as that would take too much time, but there's one card that I absolutely want to talk about, and that is the 4 Boa Hancock. Now, Forecast Hancock is the reason that this deck is so powerful now. Before, the issue was that when you go second, you have nothing that you can do except for the moves going first, but worse. However, Forecast Hancock, in her ability to attach a rested dong to a leader or character after you've reordered your deck, allows you to be able to play Hancock and use your leader effect for 6 dong. This means that if you just have Hancock in your hand, you're able to play 2 Forecasts and hit for 7,000. Not only this, but on the 10 dong turn, you can also play Hancock, put a dong to your leader, play another Forecast, and have 2 dong left so you can still use your leader effect. In this way, Hancock just makes so many aspects of Doflamingo that were just not quite there so much better. Not to mention that she's a Forecast 6,000 character with blocker. So now that we know the type of deck that Doflamingo is, how do we manage our resources? If, for example, we have 4 cards in hand and we play 1 out of our hand goes down to 3. Of course, this is very obvious, but what this actually means is that for something like Doflamingo, who can use their leader effect to play a card off of the top of their deck, they were able to summon a character without reducing their hand size. In this way, Doflamingo can actually work very well as a mid-range deck, because Doflamingo's allowed to play these powerful bodies without reducing their hand. Not only this, but he has so many cards that increase his hand, so there's a lot of times where for some reason you played a character and your hand went to 5. Now historically there are 4 versions of Doflamingo. This is the standard aggro list, the resource gathering mid-range list, 90% Doflamingo, and then the bounce mid-range list. I know these names suck, I'm sorry. I think that all 4 of these lists do actually have a scenario where they can be good, though there are decks that I prefer. In Japan in OP09, you'll generally only see 2 of these types of decks, but historically in OP08.5, although of course in Japan we still had Red-Purple Law, other 2 types of decks did see some play occasionally, and as it's difficult to predict how the meta is going to develop, I thought it would just make sense to look over all 4 decks. Let's start with the standard aggro list. The standard aggro list does not run a character that is over 4 cost. Generally, when you think of using Doflamingo's leader ability the best, you would think of a list like this. Cards such as Weevil, the start deck Moria, and the start deck Crocodile are very good tools that can be played off of your leader effect that also increase your hand. In this way, this deck is trying to just keep playing bodies and push the opponent over, using the cards in their hand to defend their board to maintain pressure, and finish the game through this means and this mean alone. One card that you may notice that's not in this list is the 2-cost Teach. Now, the 2-cost Teach is used in many lists because it's quite strong in the mirror. However, it has a large demerit, as although it lets you play any card that you want from your hand, that is the issue. If you play a card that's from your hand, you're not playing it from your deck, and then as such, your hand size is going down the more that you use Teach. I don't think that a burn aggro version of Doflamingo, where you play 2-cost Teach and then just spam out bodies as fast as possible, is actually good, because the power of Doflamingo is in his resource gaining. As such, I think even if you're playing an aggressive list, it's important to control your aggression and be stable to maintain resources in your hand so that you can defend your board to continuously hit at very annoying thresholds over and over again. Now, personally, for the standard aggro list, I think it would make sense to run at least 1 Perfume Ephemerid because of how it's trying to finish the game. However, this is a list by my friend who has won many tournaments, and I trust how he thinks more than I trust how I think. So this is his list. He thinks that you don't need Perfume Ephemerid, so try out both lists, I guess, and decide on your own which one you need more. The second list that we're talking about is actually the most popular list in OP08.5 in Japan, because 10-cost Kaido was very good not only in the mirror, but also into Red-Purple Law if you were countering correctly. When you build Doflamingo, there are 2 ways that you can think about it. You can use the leader effect to push the advantage of the leader and use it as well as possible, or you can use the leader effect to make up for the weaknesses of your leader. Doflamingo is not a late game deck. However, by playing these strong early game characters that the opponent has to deal with, it sets up opportunities where you have the time to be able to play cards such as 10-cost Kaido. If you're on low life, it's generally difficult to play Kaido because the opponent will just hit you hard and then make you lose all of the cards that you played. However, if you're at high health and you play 10-cost Kaido, then he can be very strong, as he will constantly hitting at 12,000 and drew you 4 cards. Doflamingo as a deck doesn't generally want the game to go too many turns past 10 dong, and as such, playing a 10-cost on 10 dong can feel quite slow when you can do very explosive things with Hancock on these turns. Regardless, 10-cost Kaido is very strong in the mirror if the opponent doesn't run Red Rock, and will just keep accumulating value over time if you let it. Nonetheless, this list may be slightly weak against black, so keep that in mind. However, if you are in a scenario where there aren't too many black decks around you, this can shine in certain scenarios. The next list is 90% Doflamingo. Now, this list actually never was popular in Japan, but I won a tournament with it in OP08.5, so I thought I should mention it anyways. I believe that this list was popularized or made even by Wimmybear, but I'm not entirely sure on that. Nonetheless, this is a very beginner-friendly build, as it does not force you to memorize the top of your deck, as basically your lead ability will hit around 90% of the time. As you're going to be spamming out bodies every single turn, cards such as the 3-cost Doflamingo, not the blocker one, are very good to use, as it helps you create more power on the board without diminishing your hand size. I hope you're starting to notice how important hand size is to this deck. You really want to use your resources wisely, and that is why this deck is so difficult. I will mention that probably running 4 of this 3-cost Doflamingo is a bit overkill, probably 2 at most is best. To understand how this concept works, I put in 4 for this list, feel free to move it around however you want. Finally, the balanced mid-range deck. This is the list that I use in most of my videos talking about Doflamingo recently. As you can see from any of my last videos, it's probably Doflamingo. But I really like this list, and you'll notice that it runs 2-cost Teach. But why use a very aggro-looking card in a mid-range deck? It's because I don't think that Teach is exclusively an aggro card. While Teach can make your early game very powerful, he also reduces your resources. As such, I think it's very strong to use Teach after you've accumulated resources to exchange those resources for power from the mid-game to change your solid mid-game board into a very aggressive board that can finish the game within the next couple of turns. The biggest issue about Teach is that he diminishes your hand size. However, Jozu as well as 4-cost Law bounce cards back to your hand. As such, these cards, although they might not be considered at first as cards that increase your hand size, actually do increase your hand size. Law and Jozu can both help you bounce back the 1 cost that you've already used to your hand to use either for the effect again or even as counter. After they've randomly given you that counter, they also have an effect to bounce back a 4 cost for Law or a 6 cost for Jozu. In this version of the list, you use Law and Jozu to not only bounce back your own resources to make up for things such as Teach, but also to bounce back the opponent's characters so that they can't take back your board as hard as they would want to. In this way, it's a very controlled mid-range deck that pushes over the opponent in a very uncomfortable way that's not very fun to play against. Doflamingo's early game is the most important aspect to him. As such, knowing what you should be mulliganing for and how you should be playing these first 3 turns is very important. Now, generally, regardless of the situation, if you're going first, you are going to be using your leader effect on 3-dong. If you miss it, that sucks. If you hit it, great. Conversely, on your 4-dong turn, you're generally going to be playing Jinbe. If you play Jinbe into Weevil, you're recurring some of the resources that you played from playing 2 characters and setting up a strong board to be able to hit from next turn. On 5-dong going first or 6-dong going second, generally you'd think that on 5-dong you should be playing Jinbe Weevil and hitting with 6000, or on 6-dong you should be playing Hancock and then leader effects. However, sometimes we just don't have these things. As such, it's important to know what we can do in these scenarios. It's sometimes better to just use the characters that you have on your board and just hit extremely hard. If you're going first, then you're going to have 1 character on the board at this point, but you've already hit with 7000 once. As such, presumably if the opponent is a 5-life leader, they're at 4 life. If you hit them with 7000, 7000, or 7000, 8000, if you have a 6000 character on the board, then the opponent is forced to cut counter, or go down to 2 life. While many decks try to burn resources in the opponent's hand by hitting the opponent's board, Doflamingo burns the opponent's resources by hitting the opponent's life. By pressuring the opponent's life and threatening them with cards such as Perfume Femide, you create scenarios where the opponent has to counter constantly. As such, on these turns where your board development might be weak, switching to just hitting extremely hard for 1 turn suddenly with 7000, 7000, 8000, for example, if you're going second, can be very strong to cover these weak turns and set up for a stronger turn next turn, where you can either rebuild your board or continue that aggression. Doflamingo has immense flexibility in being able to play this aggressive style as well as this defensive style and not even having to commit to one or the other at the start of the game. On the flip of a dime, they can choose mid-game which style to go for from turn to turn. They can decide to put the opponent down early so that all of their attacks need to be countered from the mid-game onward, or they can set up their board to slowly pressure resource out of their opponent's hand over time. Each deck puts a different amount of value on their life and their characters. For example, a deck like Iwankofu puts very little value on the number of cards in their hand, as it actually benefits them to be on lower cards. But conversely, a deck like NL is the exact opposite, where they have very little importance on their life, as their game effectively starts from when they hit 1. Doflamingo falls into this category where his board and hand is much more important than his life. As such, it's important to sometimes find turns where you leave your characters active on purpose so that the opponent is obligated to hit your life to give you more resources. Balancing these turns where you don't hit at all with your characters and when you hit really hard with all of your characters is very tricky and needs lots of practice, but the first step is to just understand that these scenarios do exist. I'll just be going over 3 popular matchups and a few key points that can help you get an advantage in them. These matchups are Lucci, Black Yellow Luffy, and the Mirror. The Lucci matchup was historically one that Doflamingo struggled with. However, as Lucci lost NES Lobby, the matchup has become a lot more close. While I can't say that it's absolutely winning for Doflamingo, it largely comes down to Lucci's draws and how effectively he can continuously clear the board. Of course, without NES Lobby, this becomes much more difficult, which is why Doflamingo has a much better shot in this current meta. The most important card in this matchup for the Doflamingo side is Jinbe. Jinbe, of course, is a 4-cost that plays another 4-cost, and you can imagine how hard that is to clear for a deck like Lucci. But the true power of Doflamingo in this matchup comes when he's allowed to play multiple Jinbe. Now, of course, you won't always draw multiple Jinbe, but you can just use the same Jinbe over and over again. If the opponent ignores your Jinbe, then of course, you have a free hit, but then you can play 4-cost Slaw to bounce back the Jinbe, to play Jinbe again. In doing this, now the Jinbe is active and played another 4-cost, which means that the opponent is forced to actually clear it with effects rather than just being able to hit into it. Not only this, but even if the opponent is aware of this tactic and KOs Jinbe, you have the 4-cost Moria, so you can just grab Jinbe out of trash and then use him again. Jinbe is extremely powerful, and then even one Jinbe can be played 2, sometimes even 3 times. If you can get multiple Jinbe, it can just be very hard for the opponent to play against. As such, mainly for the merit of being able to attack first and delay the opponent's jack, I prefer to go first in this matchup and look for many Jinbes to be able to play on these 5 and 7 long turns. Now, many people have a sort of mental block when it comes to fighting Black Yellow Luffy. It's a very unorthodox deck, and they don't really know should they be hitting, should they not be hitting, when should they be hitting, how much should they be hitting for. However, for Doflamingo, this is very much a mind game. As we mentioned, the way in which Doflamingo gets cards out of the opponent's hand is by hitting the opponent's life and pressuring them really hard, forcing the opponent to counter. If we set up our board really wide with cards such as Jinbe or Teach, it creates many potential attacks the opponent has to be afraid of, resulting in the opponent needing to counter attacks even when they're not at 0 life yet. The most important card to this matchup, however, is 4-cost Pudding. Now, 4-cost Pudding just resets the opponent's hand regardless of any sort of searching or any sort of filtering, any amount of cards that they have, to 5. If the opponent doesn't play around Pudding, they will be at 0 life and about 12 cards in hand, and playing one Pudding will just end the game. BY Luffy is only as strong as the number of cards in his hand, so being able to play in a way that forces the most amount of cards out of the opponent's hand is important. Play aggressively in this matchup, because BY Luffy doesn't care about the resource in your hand, they're just trying to survive. If they can survive until they can get to 9,000 power on their leader with 1 life remaining, they've generally won. As such, you want to make it as uncomfortable for the opponent as possible, setting up many traps for them. If they're at 0 life, you can use Perfume and hit them for 15 or 16,000. If they take all of their life, they're now in range of Pudding. You want to set up many traps for the opponent that they can fall into to try to gain advantages in this way. Final matchup, and maybe one of the most difficult mirrors in the game currently, is the blue Doflamingo Mirror. Despite Doflamingo being a rather aggro or mid-range focused deck, the mirror tends to go to 30 minutes very often. You must play at a slightly fast pace if your opponent is playing slow, because there's a very real chance that the timer hits 30 minutes. The reason for this is because in this matchup, you're not trying to finish the opponent by hitting their life. Doflamingo has way too many cards that can be played on the board and way too many resources in hand that you cannot just rush him down. As such, you need to be playing for board, and if both players can continuously play 2 to 3 things on the board every single turn without reducing their hand, you can see how it can start to become very long. Instead of talking about very intricate situations that'll maybe only come up in once every 10 games, I want to talk about a situation that'll probably come up 6 times in a game. 4-cost Slaw can bounce any of your characters to bounce any 4-cost. What this means is that he can also bounce himself. If you use 4-cost Slaw over and over again to bounce himself, to bounce one of the opponent's more higher value characters such as Weevil or Hancock, then you're reducing the opponent's board for no hand cost and makes it easier for you to take the board after that. However, paying 4 dong to just bounce a 4 cost is very inefficient and doesn't actually develop your board, which is something you do need to be careful of. There are 2 ways to work around this. One of them is to run Teach. Now, 2-cost Teach allows you to put the 4-cost Slaw into your draw pile to be able to, off of your leader effect, immediately bounce back the law, and you can do this over and over again with the Teach effect. This is generally the strongest, but not every list runs 2-cost Teach, so there are other ways that you can accomplish this as well. If you have 2 4-cost Slaws, then you can play one active. You never want to play it rested because the opponent will target all of their attacks into it. You play it active, you hit with it the next turn, and then play your second law to bounce back the rested law. By doing this, you are permanently doing the same cycle and still being able to weave in attacks that you wouldn't be able to if you were to just immediately bounce the law that you played. Nonetheless, the Doflamingo Mirror is quite a pain, but being able to use these very small advantages to find ways to get little bits of resources out of the opponent's hand over the course of 25 minutes, you can start to win the game. I've only scratched the surface on what Doflamingo is capable of, but it's a really difficult and really fascinating deck, in all aspects. It is one of the most complicated decks to play as well as to build, and I think that makes it quite exciting. I hope that you guys don't just use these lists as gospel and take them straight to your regionals, because there's so much that you can do in the deck building aspects. Mess around with techs that you think you might need, like Gravity Blade or Perfume, and find out which cards you might not need. And find a deck that suits the way that you want to play and suits the meta around you. Doflamingo is an extremely flexible deck, not only in the way that he's built, but in the way that he's played. If you guys found this useful or know someone that this might be useful to, make sure to send it their way. Subscribe if you haven't. Please let me know what you thought about this. This is the first guide type video that I've put out, but I am planning to put out many, many more, so stay tuned for that. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.